Hello, I'm Jo Marchant. Welcome to Where the Wild Thoughts Are. What happens if we let go of our expectations about nature? All the things we think it is, or isn't, or should be, and just listen. This week, our guide into the unknown is award-winning sound artist and ecologist David de la Haye. I first met him quite recently at an event in London where I was giving a talk about the science of awe, and David came up to me afterwards to tell me about the awe that he finds through his work with sound. Essentially, he puts hydrophones into the water and records the submerged soundscapes of ponds. He calls it sonic pond dipping.
I find it fascinating that there's a whole other world out there. We only hear a very small wavelength of sound. Using the technology to access something that's kind of more than human. Yeah, it's kind of like looking down into another universe. The more you listen, the more you tune in, the more little things you hear.
Rather than dissecting out individual noises or creatures, although that is possible, David's work is primarily about listening to the pond in an immersive and very personal way, almost like a meditation, not analysing or prejudging, but just experiencing, meeting life where it is, I guess you could say, to discover what that does for us and what it tells us about these wild spaces that are on our doorstep, literally in our gardens, that we so often overlook. Before we meet David, let's start by listening to one of his soundscapes. This is a pond at Wheat Fen Nature Reserve in Norfolk. David de la Haye, welcome to Where the Wild Thoughts Are.
Well, thank you for having me.
First of all, how did you come to be doing this? Were you always listening to the world, even as a kid?
Yeah, well, I grew up on an island. I grew up in Jersey, in the Channel Islands. And so, on an island that's 9 miles by 5, you can't really get away from the sea, at least. So I think, that connection to water has always been very close to me. I grew up, we had as part of working class family. Trips to the beach are free, so we used to go there all the time, and spent a lot of time just exploring the rock pools. I think that's probably that feeling of listening to the waves crash. The sense of this oceanic feeling, this kind of oneness with this vast external world, and I think that's where my particular fascination with water maybe started.
And then you became a musician?
Yeah, I got into music relatively later, I guess. I don't know, at the age of 12 or 13 in secondary school. I enjoyed just bashing around on the pianos, really. But I really enjoyed improvising, playing with tones. Went on to study music, so I studied jazz at Leeds College of Music later on for my degree. And then did a master's in electronic composition later. Now, doing a PhD at Newcastle, I play a lot on the folk music scene.
Those different kinds of music you've just mentioned, there's that creative improvisational side to them. The sorts of things where you have to really be in the moment and listening to the other people that you're playing with, or not necessarily knowing what's going to come next. Yeah,
the performative side that's what I find most fascinating. How we play music together, how we listen together.
So when did you start recording sounds from nature?
Maybe 12 years ago or so, 12, 15 years ago. I decided to borrow some microphones and go and record some fiddle playing out in the woodland. For no real reason, really. I was just curious about what it would sound like, because I was so used to a studio environment where the sound is very predictable, I guess. It's a kind of a sterile environment. You know what you're going to get, and you try and get the best quality sound you can out of the equipment you've got and the players you have. But taking that outside and having this challenge of dealing with the elements and of coping with with the unknown, really. It was at night times, so there may have been some other wildlife out there, maybe owls or badgers or whatever, just around this woodland in a remote part of Scotland, and just thought it'd be a nice thing to try and record some fiddle out there and see how all those elements combined.
That sounds magical.
The human and the natural. So that was my first time kind of trying to record in nature. That sense of treading into unknown territories is exciting.
When did you first think about putting microphones into the water?
And obviously, from growing up by the coast anyway and going to these rock pools, my first inclination was what's going on in the rock pools. So I borrowed a hydrophone and went to the sea and did some of that.
Wow, I love that sort of crunching at the end there. I don't know what was going on with that.
I wasn't sure what was going on with that either. That was the fascinating thing, hearing all these sounds and not really knowing what they were.
Yeah, and I loved how the gulls that would normally be in our terrain are the distant thing, and then you're actually, the sound really makes you feel immersed in this, sort of on the other side, if you like, in this other world with all these other sounds. Yeah,
some terrestrial sounds do couple with the water and do transcend the water to some degree. So you hear the birds quite clearly, but the opposite isn't true. It'd be amazing if it was, because you could have this misty air of dolphin and whale song just hovering above the water, and that would be amazing. That doesn't happen. But I guess the hydrophone as a tool was invented as an eavesdropping tool for eavesdropping on submarines, I guess. And it's quite fascinating that in the context of hydrophone listening, it wasn't just that we were eavesdropping on people, we were actually inadvertently eavesdropping on lots of other animals and creatures that lived in the sea. And so there's always that connotation.
So secretly being allowed into a world that we don't normally have any access to.
Yeah.
So is that part of the appeal for going underwater with this, because they're the sounds that don't usually escape out, whereas birds and animals, that's a bit more familiar to us?
Yeah, I find it fascinating that there's a whole other world out there. We only hear a very small wavelength of sound. There's lots of stuff, the infrasonic stuff that's below our hearing, and the ultrasonic that's above. But we're in this quite narrow band of frequencies, really. But also the way that sound travels through different mediums. So our ears don't work particularly well in water. So that way of using the technology to access something that's kind of more than human and makes us aware that we share this world with a whole other vast amount of species that perceive their environments in a very different way.
You've got another clip with some seals playing. What's the story behind this?
So I was on a cetacean research group trip in the Hebrides, the inner and the outer. Most of the job was, looking for cetacean activity and doing some bird monitoring as well. But I couldn't help but take my hydrophones with me. So we were away for 10 days and had this the opportunity to. We barely made landfall, so we were out at sea for nearly the whole trip. And each night we were anchored, I'd put my hydrophones into the water and just tune in to what was going on. And this was sort of mid to late September, and it just happened to be popping season for the grey seals. So we could see these hordes and harems, I think, of grey seals on the shore. And what I didn't expect to hear were so many seals swimming around underneath us on the boat. And you have to kind of picture, we're out there, it was very calm. It was almost a full moon, clear night, and we had the headphones sticking out of our bunk. And I just shared the headphones around people that I was sharing my cabin with. And we just sat and listened for sort of 10 minutes at a time, listening to these seals, very aware that they were swimming around just beneath the hull of our boat. And even the researchers on board who had been on these trips many times had never really listened to the sounds of these seals. And the incredible thing was the range of the vocalizations. I did a bit of research after. There wasn't very much research, again, that I could find on grey seal vocalization underwater, but it seemed that there were 10 possible vocalizations. So types of grunts and squeaks and squeals and all manner of activity. And one of them at the time, you can hear something, even in that clip, you could hear something that sounds a bit like a gunshot or a clap or something. A very loud, distinct sound. And a few weeks after I'd made these recordings, there was an article came out from a diver up in Newcastle. And he'd filmed seals literally clapping under the water, which must involve incredible amount of force.
Yeah, to get that amount of noise under the water.
You try clapping underwater, you know how hard it is. So that was the first time it was proven it wasn't a vocalization, it was actually a physical activity.
How did you get from there to recording the sounds of ponds? What drew you to ponds as a habitat?
Well, it's very nice to go on a boat trip out at sea for a number of days, but it's, I was lucky to have some funding to go on that trip. It's not something I think most people can go and do. Whereas ponds, you find ponds everywhere. So you can build your own pond in a matter of days, and which is fantastic for all sorts of biodiversity, but also fantastic as a form of composition, I guess, as a way of listening back to what sounds are going to emerge from that pond. I just feel they're wonderful, mysterious spaces that are dotted around, but just completely overlooked. I could tell you a bunch of facts about ponds. I could tell you that they support more biodiversity than rivers and lakes combined, or that we've lost 2/3 of ponds in England and Wales over the last century, or even that we find ponds on every continent on Earth. But all these facts and data don't really help us connect, I don't think. What I love about listening is it really tells a story of what's going on inside the pond, and that's when I got really excited about recording the audio from ponds and inviting other people to listen.
Yeah, there's something about listening, isn't it? I don't know if it's because we rely on vision so much that you get quite habitual in the way that you look at the world. So I don't know, there's something about hearing that the sound kind of immediately takes you into a new place. And
it's deeply personal as well. When we visualize things, or when we look, it's very objective. We look at things, but when we listen to. It's kind of more subjective. I think we literally feel it resonates with our anatomy. That's how we perceive sound. So it's a very personal thing.
Can we listen to one of your clips from one of the ponds that you've recorded?
Of course.
Wow, there's a lot going on there. It's completely not what I imagined a pond was going to sound like.
Yeah, people are often astounded that it doesn't sound like water.
Well, it almost sounds quite technological. Do you know what I mean? Like all these beeps and buzzes. Like if you play that to me and said, "Oh, scientists have just discovered life on an alien planet, and this is the audio that's coming in," you'd be like, "Yeah, that's kind of that's kind of what I would expect."
This is one of the more unusual pond sounds. We often think of ponds as, we think of amphibians and of insects, and we don't really think about the fact that plants also occupy ponds quite heavily, and pond plants especially are some of the noisiest inhabitants of ponds. So this is actually the sound of a pond plant. These perpetual rhythms go on, presumably produced as they photosynthesize.
Yeah, it's really rhythmic, isn't it? I'm surprised by that.
Yeah, and as long as the sun is out, these sounds will emerge from the plants.
Yeah, it is like a whole percussion section doing its thing. We heard a kind of squeaking sound a moment ago. Do you know what that was?
I think, again, there's not a lot of research into... The research in pond soundscapes is very, very scant on the ground. There's not very much at all, let alone the specifics of plant sounds in particular. So I can't say for certain, but I'd imagine that it's different physiological attributes of a plant releasing some chemical exchange in the water. Not really sure how all of these different tones and rhythms all become manifest in the water, but it's again it's a fascinating way of connecting to these life-giving organisms, and the idea that Darwin talks about this warm little pond that all life emerged from, and this primordial soup, and imagining that these sounds, they would have been in there, they would have been in that water. There's no doubt that there would have been photosynthesizing plants there, and so I wonder sometimes whether that our sense of rhythm being fundamental to being human, whether that somehow traces all the way back to that primordial soup, to that pond and those plants that we completely rely on in our coexistence on Earth.
You can just imagine there's this sort of rhythm that's been beating out for however many million years, billions of years. There's something about sound that almost collapses your sense of time, but also the sense of scale, so that the size difference no longer matters, because you're on that level with the pond creatures. You're there inside the pond. And
the way all those little micro sounds feed straight into your ear.
Yeah, or like something's zipping by. So you feel like you're down at that scale, and it does feel like this huge wilderness. How much of interest is it for you to know what's making all these different sounds? Do you want to know, what was that sort of squeaking? What was that buzzing thing? Or is it more to do with just the overall impression that the sound coming together is having for you?
At first, I was more interested in the types of sound I was recording. I was wondering how I could use them musically. But you can't help but be curious about what is making these sounds. So I have obviously tried to learn as much as I can, and it's made more difficult, I said, because of the under-researched nature of pond soundscapes. But I've learnt to identify a couple of different invertebrates, and I'm working on the plants right now to try and figure out if different plants maybe have their own sonic signature, or maybe they have a particular pattern.
Is there scientific value also to these sounds?
Yeah. For instance, specific invertebrates are quite picky about the sorts of water that they'll live in. So you will only find dragonfly larvae in clean water, for example. So if you could measure the sound of dragonfly larvae, if there was such, and hear that, then you'd know that the water was relatively clean. In the realm of bioacoustics, identifying where wildlife migrates or moves around by listening. Maybe we could track invasive species by listening in water, for example.
You were saying a lot of these sounds haven't been documented and we don't know much about what's contributing to these soundscapes. Why do we know so little?
I don't know. Maybe we've got a human-centric oral viewpoint about how, we know a lot about birdsong, we know a lot about other animal behaviour terrestrially. Ponds have a tough time. We use words like pond life or pond scum. They're kind of disparaging, and it suggests this kind of worthlessness. Also, they're not very grand. There's a tendency to overlook things that are small, I think. There's quite a lot of research on rivers and lakes, and that's what we think of with freshwater. But as I said before, it's ponds that hold the highest biodiversity of all of them.
Just hearing those sounds, it's a really nice reminder, I guess, that the way we normally look at the world and what you think of as this tiny little hole in the ground, all of these life processes, fights for survival and cooperations and, everything that you would get in an ecosystem is happening there.
Yeah, there's a paper called The Lake as a Microcosm, but I think we can go smaller than that. The pond is its own microcosm. The more you look in, the more you find, and that's visually and sonically as well. And I love that microsonic element of listening to a pond, all these tiny little sounds that carry so much information.
And you're running workshops so that people can come and hear these sounds for themselves?
Yeah, I run sonic pond dipping workshops.
That's a great phrase, sonic pond dipping.
And the first one was just a one-off event in 2022. I thought it'd be a fun thing to try out. But it's continued ever since, and we've run, I think, over 50 workshops since then, with nature reserves and schools and science conferences, and shared the sounds recorded in ponds mostly, and occasionally rivers, with people from all sorts of backgrounds, all different ages, and that's been fascinating to get people's responses. There's one fantastic response from a kid going, "How does a pond have a sound?" and it's kind of cool. And other people saying that it sounds like techno. You mentioned before that the plants sound very, very mechanical and not very biotic at all. So I've started to again musically explore this sort of dualism between the biotic sounds and technological sounds, and the way we have to rely on technology to hear these sounds anyway. I was at a conference recently as well. One person who'd been studying freshwater plants for their whole life said it was like finding a new connection with their beloved plants and freshwater environments. And that's really touching because they by far more an expert on aquatic plants or macrophytes than I am, but to open up a new way of exploring the freshwater world for them and renew that sense of excitement about it again.
And you haven't just stopped to listening to these soundscapes. You mentioned some of the parallels with rhythm and with music. I love how you're then coming back to your musical roots and responding to these soundscapes with music.
Yeah, I've become more and more fascinated with the idea of making music with nature, with this kind of multi-species approach to music making. So one project I put together a few years ago as a commission with Sound and Music was a project called With Ears Underwater. I had 3 friends who are improvising musicians from different backgrounds. One's a drummer, one's a saxophone player, one's a cellist. And I sent them all clips from different underwater habitats without any naming, no information about what the sounds were. They were just numbered clips. And each person had a different sort of zone of hydrophone recordings. So one person had marine recordings, one person had rock pools, and one person had ponds, and or something like that. And we got together in the studio, and I asked them just to play together, just improvising from the clips that they'd had. I asked them if they could musically respond and create a kind of repertoire based on the sounds they were hearing. And this unexpectedly became a full album called With Ears Underwater. And the track Plant-Based Patterns, which we're listening to now, actually went on to be nominated for an Ivor Novello Composer Award in the jazz category, which I was most surprised at.
Wow, yeah.
But yeah, it's a way again of how the musical worlds, the sonic worlds, can be. I've lost my train of thought. Too many things to concentrate on.
Yeah, well, it's tempting just to listen, isn't it? Yeah. So, I love how that's coming back full circle to the music that you were talking about at the beginning, and improvising and being in the moment. And I suppose you have to really be immersed and listen in order to respond in that way in the moment, don't you? So it does feel like a really lovely meeting with nature.
Yeah, what I love about the act of freely improvised music is that at its core it's about listening and responding, and it's not really about capturing or quantizing or trying to kind of mess with it too much. And one thing I always hold dear in my recordings is to not really edit the field recordings. I usually play them just as they are. I might clean them up a little bit or bring out certain frequencies, but I try not to edit or ventriloquize for nature. You know, if trying to put it has its own voice. I'd try and leave that as clear and clean as possible, and just allow humans to experience these underwater sounds and respond in real time. So.
It's almost you find yourself questioning which are the natural sounds and what you've added. Wow, it's amazing. So what were the circumstances of this, or how did you go about making that piece of music?
Well, yeah, this as you mentioned, this uncertainty about what's biotic and what's electronic is exactly a new kind of repertoire that I'm developing right now. This is an improvisation that, as well as making music, I'm now making ponds. So I dug a garden pond specifically for this, and it just allowed me to send a live feed from the pond straight into my house, which means I can sit in my loft and listen to my pond whenever I want. but more than that,
I would love that, a pond in the garden and a live feed. That sounds amazing.
So, but it also allowed me to improvise in real time with the pond, and so I am using electronic gizmos. I've specifically chosen 2 or 3 little electronic musical instruments that are very unpredictable. Again, it's going with this kind of spontaneity about not knowing what we're going to hear from a pond, because you might one day hear something you've never heard before, and that happens quite regularly. And I quite like the fact that maybe these instruments will throw out sounds I've never heard as well. So I purposely have this kind of sense of an ordered sort of spontaneity. I've tried to create some sounds that I can sort of recall that sound a bit pondy, and try and improvise along with the pond. You see, there's quite there's a bit of a fad at the minute for these plant music.
Yeah,
systems,
yeah.
these
I'm
little
following it
electrodes.
on Instagram, and you see the fungus or the plant or whatever playing the xylophone or something.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not really a fan of that. So I'm not. I'll explain why. I think I love the fact that these nodes pick up the chemical changes in the biotic system, and then they're transcoded into data somehow, probably through MIDI. But I think this is problematic because the triggered sounds could be anything. They could be, it could be the sound of a nice gentle pad-like sound, or it could be the sound of a lightsaber. It could be anything. I think for me it removes the sonic agency of the natural world and replaces it with something that humans want to hear. And so they want it to sound ambient, or they want it to sound calm or blissful or whatever. But what I'm trying to do here is to not alter the sounds of the plants. I'm trying to improvise along with the plants. So the plant sounds, and actually other insects and other things that are in that recording, they're still there. They're still embedded in the recording. They haven't been altered in any way. It's just I'm trying to create a dialogue with them.
I love the idea of the pond as a creative partner, and this idea of allowing nature to have its agency.
Yeah.
And the sounds are amazing. I mean, it's almost, well, it feels like it's really good for my brain in some strange way. I think because it's not necessarily conforming to all of your expectations.
Well, people at the Sonic Pond Dipping workshops do the same thing. A lot of people say how relaxing they find it, but the sounds that we hear are actually sometimes quite harsh and quite glitchy. And there's all this kind of microsound, all these little clicks and pops and things. And
I feel like it's opening up new paths in my brain.
I'd love to know what was going on in the brain, to actually study what's actually happening up there when we're listening to the sounds of these, as I mentioned before, this ancient rhythmic music.
So your work with the soundscapes, do you think that has changed how you think about nature, life, the world generally? Is this connection something that you bring back and then apply in the rest of your life?
I think just being humble, and that we've got so much to learn even from a space on our doorstep, and just be awestruck by all the stuff that's going on there. Makes us realise that it's kind of like looking down into another universe. The more you listen, the more you tune in, the more little things you hear, and taking away that deeply embodied sort of sense of that rhythm has been there throughout all of eternity. They're the two things that really stick with me. But also, it's tempting to use Google or AI or something to find answers. We've got all the answers at our fingertips, right? And it's kind of like we've usurped mystery for mastery. There's all this mystery around us, and I kind of also don't want to master it. I kind of don't want to know what's going on in the pond. I want it to be always a mystery, to invoke more curiosity about the world.
There is that lovely connection to wonder and awe and the way that we connect with the world around us and feel part of something bigger, because that's something that I've been writing about and speaking about. If you want to go out and experience awe in nature, there's this whole idea of seeing with firstness, which I wonder if we should change to hearing with firstness. But anyway, this idea of seeing the ordinary as if it's extraordinary, seeing things as if it's for the first time. So things that you take for granted, how can you see them with fresh eyes? And one of the things for doing that is to concentrate on different senses. So instead of just looking, what can you feel? What can you smell? How does the air taste? And what can you hear? So this seems to fit really well into that.
Yeah, especially with something that's small and overlooked like a pond. We could walk past them all the time. The hearing with firstness, I love that phrase. It's fantastic.
So I did just want to finish with one more clip, which is of your son. Could you just introduce what's happening in this clip and then we'll listen?
This was one of my favourite clips, I think. So my son was 2. He'd woken up very early in the morning, as you hear at the beginning of the clip. And I just had my recorder beside the front door, like I normally did, so I grabbed it on the way out because it was spring. And in spring we get lovely dawn choruses. And just his reaction is, if you're going to sum up awe in one phrase, or one soundbite. I think this is it.
Got really early, didn't you? Yeah. So listen to the birds. Can you hear them?
Yes! Who's that? Who's that? Wow! Wow.
David De La Haye, thank you for sharing your wild thoughts with me.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with David De La Haye and listening to those underwater sounds. You can find more about David's work, including sonic pond dipping, at his website, www.daviddelahaye.com. There's also more information about everything we discussed in the show notes for this episode, including details of the clips that we played. I hope you can join us again next week for another journey beyond the expected. We're actually nearing the end of this first season of Where the Wild Thoughts Are. If you like what you're hearing so far, though, please do follow the show to catch the final episodes and make sure you don't miss news of Season 2, which I am already excited about. See you next time on Where the Wild Thoughts Are.